Have you ever witnessed a moment that completely shattered everything you thought you knew about someone? A single second where reality flips upside down, and you're left questioning every assumption you've ever made? Sarah Martinez thought she was just doing her job that Tuesday morning. As a bank teller in downtown Chicago, she'd seen it all, or so she believed. But nothing could have prepared her for the woman who walked through those glass doors at 10:47 a.m., clutching a worn leather purse and wearing clothes that had seen better days. What started as a routine transaction would become the most extraordinary encounter of Sarah's life. Because sometimes, the most profound truths hide behind the most ordinary faces. Sometimes, a simple request for identification can unlock secrets that have been buried for decades. This is the story of Margaret Thompson, a woman whose appearance deceived everyone, whose past was more incredible than fiction, and whose identity reveal would leave an entire bank speechless, some in tears, and others forever changed. Are you ready to discover what happens when assumptions crumble and the extraordinary emerges from the seemingly ordinary? The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of First National Bank, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. Sarah Martinez adjusted her name tag and checked her cash drawer one final time before the doors opened to the public. At 28, she had worked as a bank teller for 5 years, long enough to develop a sixth sense about people who walked through those doors. She could spot the nervous first-time home buyers, the frustrated business owners dealing with loan applications, and the elderly customers who just wanted someone to talk to while they conducted their banking. Sarah prided herself on treating everyone with respect, but she couldn't deny that appearances often told a story before words ever did. The morning rush had been typical. Mrs. Chen deposited her Social Security check while complaining about her grandson's spending habits. Mr. Rodriguez cashed his paycheck and asked about opening a savings account for his daughter's quinceañera. A young professional in an expensive suit made a large withdrawal, barely acknowledging Sarah's polite small talk. It was 10:47 a.m. when Margaret Thompson entered the bank. Sarah noticed her immediately, not because she stood out, but because she seemed to blend into the background so completely. Margaret appeared to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and deep lines etched around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. She wore a faded brown coat that had seen many winters, sensible shoes that had walked countless miles, and carried a leather purse that had clearly been well loved for decades. Margaret approached Sarah's window with careful, measured steps. Her posture was straight despite her age, and there was something in her bearing that suggested she had once commanded attention in rooms full of important people. But her current appearance told a different story, one of financial struggle and social invisibility. "Good morning," Sarah said with her practiced professional smile. "How can I help you today?" Margaret's voice was soft but clear, with the faintest trace of an accent that Sarah couldn't quite place. "I would like to make a withdrawal, please." "Of course. Do you have your account number?" Margaret fumbled through her purse, which seemed to contain the accumulated treasures and necessities of a long life. Sarah caught glimpses of old photographs, medicine bottles, a worn address book, and what looked like faded newspaper clippings. Finally, Margaret produced a small piece of paper with numbers written in careful handwriting. Sarah typed the account number into her computer and waited for the information to load. What appeared on her screen made her blink in confusion. She double-checked the numbers and typed them again, certain she had made an error. The account showed a balance that seemed impossibly high for someone of Margaret's apparent means. Sarah had seen wealthy customers before, but they typically arrived in expensive cars, wore designer clothes, and carried themselves with the confidence that money provides. Margaret Thompson looked like she counted every penny before spending it. "Ma'am, I'll need to see some identification to proceed with this transaction," Sarah said, following standard protocol while trying to hide her surprise at the account balance. "Of course, dear," Margaret replied, reaching into her purse once again. This time, her search was more deliberate, as if she was looking for something specific that she kept in a special place. While Margaret searched, Sarah found herself studying the woman more carefully. Despite her modest appearance, there was something refined about Margaret's mannerisms. The way she held herself, the precise way she spoke, and even how she organized her search through her purse suggested someone who had been taught proper etiquette and social graces. Behind Margaret, a small line had formed. A businessman in his 40s tapped his foot impatiently while checking his phone. A young mother juggled her toddler while trying to keep important papers from scattering. An elderly gentleman waited patiently, seeming to understand that some things shouldn't be rushed. "Here we are," Margaret said, pulling out what appeared to be an official document folder. She opened it carefully, as if the contents were precious, and removed a driver's license. Sarah accepted the license and prepared to verify the information, but, as her eyes focused on the document, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just any driver's license. The name on the identification was familiar, impossibly, incredibly familiar. She looked up at Margaret, then down at the license again, then back at Margaret. The blood drained from her face as the pieces of an unbelievable puzzle began to fall into place. "Is everything all right, dear?" Margaret asked, noticing Sarah's sudden change in demeanor. Sarah's mind raced as she processed what she was seeing. The name on the license belonged to someone she had only read about in history books and seen in old photographs. Someone who had changed the world decades ago but had seemingly disappeared from public life years ago. I'm sorry, Sarah stammered, but could you wait just one moment? I need to verify something. Margaret nodded graciously. Take your time. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she held the license. The photograph matched the woman standing before her, but the name seemed impossible. She had heard stories, legends really, about this person. Everyone had. But those stories belonged to a different era, a time when the world was fighting different battles and facing different challenges. The businessman behind Margaret cleared his throat loudly. Is there a problem here? Some of us have actual jobs to get back to. Sarah barely heard him. She was staring at identification that belonged to someone who had been declared missing, presumed dead, by the media decades ago. Someone whose disappearance had sparked international headlines and government investigations. Someone whose work had saved thousands of lives but whose personal story had ended in mystery and tragedy. But Margaret Thompson stood before her, very much alive, very much real, and apparently very much in need of conducting a simple banking transaction. "Ma'am," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you really?" She couldn't finish the question. The implications were too enormous, too impossible to comprehend. If this woman was who her identification said she was, then everything the world believed about her fate was wrong. Everything. Margaret's eyes met Sarah's, and, for the first time since entering the bank, she smiled. It was a sad, knowing smile that seemed to carry the weight of untold stories and hidden truths. "Yes, dear," Margaret said simply. "I am." The simple confirmation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gripped the counter to steady herself, aware that her professional composure was completely shattered but unable to regain it. The woman standing before her wasn't just any customer. She was someone who had shaped history, whose absence had left questions that had never been answered, whose presumed death had closed a chapter that apparently should have remained open. Around them, the normal sounds of the bank continued. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and other customers conducted their routine business. But Sarah felt as if time had stopped, as if the entire universe had shifted to accommodate this impossible moment. "I don't understand," Sarah managed to say. Why, everyone thinks you're dead?" Margaret finished gently. "Yes, I know what everyone thinks." It was necessary for them to think that. The businessman behind Margaret had grown increasingly agitated. "Look, lady, either conduct your business or get out of line. Some people have schedules to keep." Margaret turned slowly to face him, and something in her bearing changed. The humble, nearly invisible elderly woman transformed before Sarah's eyes into someone who had clearly commanded respect and attention from world leaders and powerful men. Her posture straightened further, her chin lifted slightly, and her voice carried an authority that made the businessman take an involuntary step backward. "Young man," Margaret said with quiet dignity, "some things in this world are more important than your schedule. This is one of them." The businessman opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. He muttered something under his breath but stopped his complaining. Sarah realized that other employees had begun to notice the unusual situation. Her supervisor, Mr. Patterson, was glancing over from his desk with concern. Two other tellers had stopped their transactions to watch what was happening. The security guard near the door was paying closer attention than usual. "Ma'am," Sarah said, lowering her voice further, I think we should speak privately. Would you be willing to come with me to one of our private offices?" Margaret considered this for a moment. "Will you be able to help me with my withdrawal?" Yes, Sarah assured her, though she wasn't entirely sure how they would proceed. "But I think this situation requires more discretion than we can provide out here." Margaret nodded. "That would be wise." As Sarah prepared to step away from her window, she realized that she was about to become part of something much larger than a routine banking transaction. She was about to learn the truth behind one of the most famous disappearances of the 20th century, and she had no idea how that truth would change not only her understanding of history but her understanding of what it meant to sacrifice everything for something greater than yourself. The identification in her hand felt heavier than any piece of plastic had a right to feel, weighted with secrets and stories that the world had been waiting decades to hear. And Margaret Thompson, the woman who everyone believed was dead, stood patiently waiting to trust a young bank teller with those secrets. Sarah caught Mr. Patterson's eye and motioned for him to come over. Whatever was about to happen, she knew she would need help handling it. Because she was holding identification that belonged to someone whose story had never truly ended, only gone underground, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And, apparently, that moment had arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a downtown Chicago bank, changing everything Sarah thought she knew about heroes, sacrifice, and the price of doing what's right in a complicated world. Mr. Patterson approached Sarah's window with the measured steps of a man who had managed a bank for 15 years and thought he had seen every possible situation. At 52, James Patterson had handled everything from attempted robberies to celebrity customers who demanded absolute discretion. But the look on Sarah's face was unlike anything he had encountered before. "Is there a problem, Sarah?" he asked, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him an effective manager. Sarah looked from her supervisor to Margaret, then back again. "Mr. Patterson, I need to speak with you privately for just a moment." Margaret remained patient, her hands folded over her purse, seemingly unaffected by the growing attention her presence was drawing. The young mother with the toddler had moved to another line, but the businessman and elderly gentleman remained, their curiosity clearly piqued by the unusual delay. Sarah stepped a few feet away from the window and motioned for Mr. Patterson to follow. In hushed tones, she tried to explain the impossible situation. "Sir, the customer's identification, it shows a name that I recognize from history books. I think this woman might be someone who was reported missing decades ago. Someone important." Mr. Patterson's eyebrows rose. He glanced over at Margaret, taking in her modest appearance with the practiced eye of someone who had learned not to judge customers by their clothes. "Are you certain about the identification's authenticity? It appears genuine, but, sir, if this is real, then this is much bigger than a banking matter. This is someone the whole world thought was dead." James Patterson had built his career on making sound decisions under pressure. He looked at Margaret again, noting the quiet dignity in her posture and the intelligence in her eyes. Whatever was happening here, it required careful handling. "Bring the customer to conference room B," he decided. "We'll sort this out privately." Sarah returned to her window where Margaret waited with the same patient grace she had maintained throughout the delay. "Ma'am, would you please come with me? We can handle your transaction more privately." Margaret nodded and followed Sarah through the banking floor toward the back offices. As they walked, Sarah noticed that Margaret moved with purpose and awareness, her eyes taking in details of the bank's layout and security features. It was the kind of observational habit that suggested someone who had learned to be constantly aware of her surroundings. Conference room B was small but comfortable, with a polished wooden table and several leather chairs. A window overlooked the busy street below, where ordinary people went about their ordinary lives, unaware that history was being rewritten in the building above them. Mr. Patterson closed the door and activated the privacy blinds. The three of them sat around the table, with Margaret's worn leather purse and the identification document between them like evidence in a trial that would determine the truth about one of the 20th century's greatest mysteries. "Ma'am, Mr. Patterson began carefully. My teller has expressed some concerns about your identification. Would you mind if we discussed this matter? Margaret looked at both of them with eyes that held decades of wisdom and sorrow. You're both very young, she said gently. You probably learned about me in school, if you learned about me at all. Most people today don't remember the stories from that time. Sarah leaned forward. I remember. My grandmother told me stories about you. About what you did during the war, and after. About how you disappeared when they tried to silence you. For the first time since entering the bank, Margaret's composed facade cracked slightly. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. Your grandmother was a wise woman to remember those stories. Most people preferred to forget. Mr. Patterson examined the identification document more carefully. The license was current, issued by the state of Illinois, and appeared completely legitimate. But the name printed on it belonged to someone who had been declared legally dead in 1987 after disappearing from her home in Washington, D.C., following months of death threats and government harassment. Dr. Margaret Thompson, he read aloud. Nuclear physicist. Former advisor to 3 presidents. Disappeared in 1987 after testifying before Congress about weapons proliferation. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, as if the recitation of her accomplishments caused her pain. That's not quite the whole story, but it's accurate enough. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process the implications. But if you're alive, then all the investigations, all the conspiracy theories, all the books written about your disappearance were necessary, Margaret finished. They needed to believe I was gone. It was the only way to protect the people I cared about and to continue the work that needed to be done. Mr. Patterson found himself in uncharted territory. His training had prepared him for difficult customers, complicated financial situations, and even security threats. But nothing had prepared him for sitting across from someone who had apparently faked her own death and lived in hiding for nearly 4 decades. Ma'am, he said carefully, I have to ask, why are you revealing yourself now? Why come to a bank where you knew your identification would raise questions? Margaret reached into her purse and withdrew a worn photograph. She placed it on the table between them. The black and white image showed a young woman in a lab coat standing next to a complex piece of scientific equipment. The woman in the photo looked exactly like Margaret would have looked 50 years ago. I'm dying, she said simply. Cancer. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. And there are things I need to do before I go. People I need to help. Money I need to distribute to causes that matter. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she realized they were witnessing not just the revelation of a historical mystery, but the final chapter of a remarkable life. The account you accessed, Margaret continued, contains money I've been saving for decades. Money from patents I filed under false names, investments made through shell companies, and payments for consulting work done in secret. I've lived very simply, spending almost nothing on myself, so that when this day came, I would have resources to help others. Mr. Patterson's training kicked in despite the extraordinary circumstances. Ma'am, we'll need to verify your identity through additional means before we can process large withdrawals. This is for your protection as well as ours. Margaret nodded approvingly. That's exactly what you should do. I have documentation that will satisfy your requirements. She reached into her purse again and withdrew a manila envelope. Birth certificate, social security records, fingerprints from my government clearance files, and DNA samples that can be verified against medical records from my time in D.C. Sarah stared at the envelope. You came prepared for this. I've been preparing for this conversation for 37 years, Margaret replied. I knew that eventually, I would need to reveal myself to access these funds. I couldn't let the money sit unused when there are so many problems in the world that need solving. Mr. Patterson opened the envelope and examined the documents inside. Everything appeared legitimate, professionally prepared, and meticulously organized. This wasn't someone trying to commit fraud, this was someone who had spent decades planning for exactly this moment. Dr. Thompson, he said, using her title with newfound respect, these documents will need to be verified, but, assuming they check out, how much are you looking to withdraw? Margaret's answer shocked them both. I want to withdraw $8 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah had never dealt with a transaction that large, and she could see from Mr. Patterson's expression that even he was stunned by the amount. That's a significant sum, Mr. Patterson managed to say. It represents a lifetime of saving and careful investment, Margaret explained. And it's all going to causes I've been supporting anonymously for years. Scholarships for young scientists, funding for peace research, support for refugees, and medical research into the diseases that affect the world's poorest populations. Sarah found her voice. Why reveal yourself to do this? Couldn't you have continued making anonymous donations? Margaret's smile was sad but determined. Because I'm running out of time, and there are larger donations I want to make that require my personal involvement. I want to establish foundations that will continue this work after I'm gone. And, frankly, I'm tired of hiding. She paused, looking out the window at the bustling street below. I've lived almost 40 years in the shadows, watching the world change, seeing new problems emerge while old ones persist. I've done what good I could from hiding, but now I want to do more. I want to make a real difference in whatever time I have left. Mr. Patterson was calculating the implications of the situation. A transaction this large would require approval from the bank's regional office. The documentation would need to be thoroughly verified. And the story, if it proved true, would inevitably become public knowledge. Dr. Thompson, he said, I have to warn you that a transaction of this size, combined with your unique circumstances, will likely draw attention. Media attention. Government attention. Are you prepared for that? Margaret's expression grew firm, revealing the strength that had allowed her to stand up to presidents and congressional committees decades earlier. Mr. Patterson, I spent my career trying to prevent nuclear weapons from proliferating around the world. I testified before hostile congressmen who wanted to silence me. I survived assassination attempts and government harassment. I think I can handle whatever attention comes from trying to do good with my money. Sarah was struck by the courage it must have taken to maintain a false identity for so long, to live in anonymity while watching the world struggle with problems she could have helped solve if she hadn't been forced into hiding. What happened? She asked. Why did you have to disappear? Margaret's eyes grew distant, as if she was looking back across the decades to a time when the world was different but, in some ways, just as dangerous. I made enemies among very powerful people, she said quietly. People who profited from weapons sales and who saw my work on nuclear disarmament as a threat to their interests. When I testified before Congress about illegal weapons transfers, I signed my own death warrant. They made it clear that if I didn't disappear voluntarily, I would disappear permanently. The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. Sarah realized they weren't just dealing with a remarkable case of mistaken identity or even a fascinating historical revelation. They were dealing with someone who had sacrificed everything to do what she believed was right, and who had paid the price for that courage every day for nearly 4 decades. Mr. Patterson made a decision. Dr. Thompson, we're going to help you with this transaction. It will take some time to verify everything and get the necessary approvals, but if you're willing to be patient with the process, we'll make sure you get access to your funds. Margaret's relief was visible. Thank you. Both of you. You have no idea how difficult it's been to live with these secrets for so long. As they prepared to begin the formal verification process, Sarah realized that this ordinary Tuesday had become the most extraordinary day of her life. She was helping someone who had changed the world once and was preparing to do it again. And she understood that sometimes the most important moments come disguised as routine transactions, waiting for the right people to recognize their significance and rise to meet them. The next 2 hours transformed the quiet bank conference room into a hub of discreet but intense activity. Mr. Patterson had called his supervisor at the regional office, speaking in carefully chosen words that conveyed the extraordinary nature of the situation without revealing specific details over the phone. Sarah found herself serving as both witness and support system for a woman whose very existence challenged everything the world believed about one of history's most famous disappearances. Margaret sat patiently as Mr. Patterson worked through the bank's verification protocols. She had clearly anticipated this process, producing documents from her purse with the systematic precision of someone who had planned for this moment down to the smallest detail. Each piece of identification, each supporting document, each bit of evidence painted a picture of a woman who had lived an incredibly complex double life for nearly 4 decades. The social security numbers match, Mr. Patterson confirmed, setting down his phone after speaking with the Social Security Administration. The records show you as deceased as of 1987, but they're willing to reactivate your status pending proof of life and proper documentation. Sarah watched Margaret's face as this confirmation came through. There was relief there, but also something that looked like grief. "It's strange," Margaret said softly, "to be officially dead for so long and then, suddenly, exist again in the eyes of the government." The bank's senior fraud investigator, Janet Chen, had been called in to examine the documents. A woman in her 50s with 25 years of experience in financial crimes, Janet had developed an expert eye for detecting false identifications and fraudulent documents. But, after an hour of careful examination, she looked up with an expression of amazement. "Everything checks out," Janet announced. "The paper is correct for the time periods, the inks match what would have been used, the signatures are consistent across decades of documents, and the biometric data all aligns. This is either the most sophisticated fraud I've ever encountered, or this woman is exactly who she claims to be." Margaret managed a small smile. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Mrs. Chen. In my previous life, I learned to value people who take their jobs seriously and pay attention to details." While the verification process continued, Sarah found herself drawn into conversation with Margaret about her decades in hiding. Speaking in quiet tones to maintain privacy, Margaret began to share fragments of a story that was almost too extraordinary to believe. "Where did you go when you disappeared?" Sarah asked during a quiet moment when Mr. Patterson was on another call. Margaret looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. "Initially, to a small town in Montana where a friend from graduate school had a cabin. She was one of the few people who knew the truth about the threats I was receiving. She helped me establish a new identity and learn to live invisibly." "But, you didn't stay in Montana?" "No, dear. Staying in one place too long was dangerous. Over the years, I lived in 12 different states and 3 different countries. Always quietly, always carefully, always making sure I could disappear again if necessary." Sarah tried to imagine what that kind of life would be like, constantly looking over your shoulder, never able to form lasting relationships, never able to use your real name or acknowledge your accomplishments. "How did you survive emotionally?" Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "I stayed focused on the work. Even though I couldn't publish under my own name anymore, I could still contribute to research through intermediaries. I could still solve problems and help people, just from the shadows instead of the spotlight." Mr. Patterson returned to the table with an update. "I've spoken with our regional manager, and she's bringing this to the attention of the Federal Banking Oversight Board. A withdrawal of this size, combined with your unique circumstances, requires federal clearance." Margaret nodded as if she had expected this. "How long will that take?" "Normally, several weeks. But, given the exceptional nature of your situation, they're expediting the process. We should have an answer within 48 hours. And, in the meantime?" "In the meantime, we can process smaller withdrawals up to $50,000 at a time while the larger transaction is being approved." Margaret considered this. "That will be sufficient to begin my work. There are some immediate needs I want to address." Janet Chen had been quietly working at her laptop, running additional background checks and verification procedures. She looked up with an expression of growing wonder. "Dr. Thompson, I've been researching your disappearance, and I have to ask, do you realize how many people have been looking for you over the years?" "I'm aware of some of the attention my case received," Margaret replied carefully. "The FBI had an active investigation for 15 years. There were congressional hearings about your disappearance. Academic institutions have held symposiums about your work and what happened to you? You're mentioned in at least 40 books about government corruption and whistleblower protection. Margaret's face showed surprise. 40 books? Your disappearance became a symbol for others who were fighting government secrecy and corporate corruption. People saw what happened to you as proof that speaking truth to power came with real consequences. Sarah watched Margaret process this information. Did you know that people were using your story to inspire courage in others? Margaret shook her head slowly. I had no idea. I thought that by disappearing, I would simply be forgotten. Far from it, Janet continued. There's a scholarship fund at MIT named after you. The Margaret Thompson Institute for Scientific Ethics was established at Stanford in 1995. There are peace research centers around the world that cite your work as their inspiration. Tears formed in Margaret's eyes. I had no idea that anything positive came from what happened to me. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat gently. Dr. Thompson, I think you should know that as soon as this story becomes public, it's going to create an enormous amount of attention. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Margaret straightened in her chair, and again Sarah saw glimpses of the formidable woman she must have been in her professional prime. Mr. Patterson, I spent my career dealing with senators, generals, and defense contractors who wanted to intimidate me into silence. I think I can handle reporters and public attention. But this is different, Sarah interjected gently. This isn't just about your work or your disappearance. This is about you coming back from the dead, in a sense. People are going to want to know everything, where you've been, how you survived, why you're revealing yourself now. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. You're right, of course. And I'm prepared to tell my story. But only on my terms, and only in ways that don't endanger the people who helped me over the years. The afternoon wore on as more verifications came through. The fingerprint analysis confirmed Margaret's identity. The DNA samples she provided matched genetic markers from medical records found in archived government files. Even her dental records, preserved from her security clearance examinations in the 1980s, aligned perfectly with her current dental work. With each confirmation, the reality of the situation became more undeniable and more extraordinary. This quiet, modestly dressed woman was indeed Dr. Margaret Thompson, one of the most brilliant nuclear physicists of her generation, a woman who had advised presidents and changed national policy, and someone the world had mourned as a casualty of political corruption. There's one more thing I need to tell you, Margaret said as the verification process neared completion. The money in that account isn't just from my own savings and investments. Mr. Patterson looked up sharply. What do you mean? Over the years, other people contributed to this fund. Other scientists who were forced into silence, other government employees who witnessed corruption but couldn't speak out publicly. This money represents a collective effort by people who wanted to see positive change in the world but couldn't risk their own safety to make it happen. Sarah felt a chill as she realized the implications. How many other people are there? Other people who are supposed to be dead but aren't? Margaret shook her head. I can't reveal that information. But I can tell you that there are people working behind the scenes, people who have sacrificed their public lives to continue fighting for causes they believe in. The room fell silent as everyone contemplated what this meant. If Margaret Thompson was alive and had been working secretly for decades, how many other presumed casualties of political corruption were actually out there, operating in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface? Janet Chen broke the silence. Dr. Thompson, when this story comes out, it's going to change how people think about government accountability and whistleblower protection. Margaret's response was firm and clear. Good. Maybe it's time for those conversations to happen again. Maybe it's time for people to remember that speaking the truth is worth the risks that come with it. As the day drew to a close, Mr. Patterson had received preliminary approval for the transaction from the regional office. The larger federal review would take more time, but Margaret would be able to access her funds and begin the work she had planned. There's one more thing, Margaret said as they prepared to conclude the meeting. I want to make my first withdrawal today, and I want to give part of it to this bank. Everyone looked at her in surprise. You've all shown extraordinary professionalism and compassion in handling this situation. You could have turned me away, called security, or treated me like a crazy old woman. Instead, you listened, you investigated, and you helped me reclaim my identity. I want to establish a fund here that will provide financial assistance to other people who need to rebuild their lives." Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears. Even in the midst of reclaiming her own life, Margaret was thinking about how to help others. "Dr. Thompson," Mr. Patterson said with deep respect, "it has been an honor to help you today." As Margaret prepared to leave the bank, she turned to Sarah with a warm smile. "Thank you for treating me with kindness before you knew who I was. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Sarah realized that this day had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had witnessed not just the revelation of a historical mystery, but a lesson in courage, sacrifice, and the power of never giving up on your principles, no matter how high the cost. 2 days after Margaret Thompson's revelation at First National Bank, the carefully maintained secret that had protected her for nearly 4 decades began to unravel in ways none of them had anticipated. What started as a routine banking verification process had triggered a chain of events that would ultimately reshape public understanding of government accountability and personal sacrifice. Sarah arrived at work Wednesday morning to find Mr. Patterson already in his office, speaking in hushed tones on the phone. Through the glass walls, she could see the tension in his posture as he gestured emphatically while talking. The usually calm bank manager looked like a man who had stumbled into something much larger than he was prepared to handle. "Is everything all right?" Sarah asked when Mr. Patterson finished his call. He looked at her with the expression of someone who hadn't slept well. "The Federal Banking Oversight Board completed their preliminary review last night. Dr. Thompson's identity has been confirmed at the highest levels, and now there are people in Washington who want to know exactly how she survived for 37 years without detection." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. "Are we in trouble?" "No, but Dr. Thompson might be. Apparently, her reappearance has created quite a stir in certain government circles. People who thought her secrets died with her are now very concerned about what she might reveal." Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Margaret's number, which she had provided the previous day for follow-up communications. "Sarah, dear, could you and Mr. Patterson meet me this morning? I'm afraid our situation has become more complicated than I anticipated." They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop 6 blocks from the bank, a location Margaret suggested because it was public but not associated with their previous meetings. When Sarah and Mr. Patterson arrived, they found Margaret sitting at a corner table, looking more alert and energetic than she had seemed during her initial visit to the bank. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said as they joined her. "I needed to speak with you both because I suspect you're about to be contacted by federal investigators." Mr. Patterson's face paled. "What kind of investigators?" "The kind who want to know how I managed to live under an assumed identity for so long, where I got the money in that account, and whether I've been in contact with other people who are supposed to be dead." Sarah leaned forward. "Have you been in contact with other people like yourself?" Margaret's smile was enigmatic. "Let's just say that my reappearance has made some people in hiding very nervous, and some people in power very angry." She reached into her purse and withdrew a thick manila envelope. "This contains copies of all the documentation I provided to your bank, plus additional information that I think you should have. If anyone questions your actions or suggests you did anything inappropriate, this will demonstrate that you followed proper procedures throughout." Mr. Patterson accepted the envelope with obvious reluctance. "Dr. Thompson, I have to ask, are you putting yourself in danger by revealing your identity?" Margaret's expression grew serious. "Probably. But I'm 74 years old and dying of cancer. The people who wanted to silence me in 1987 are mostly dead or retired now. And, frankly, I'm tired of being afraid." She paused to sip her coffee, and Sarah noticed that her hands, while steady, showed a slight tremor that hadn't been there 2 days earlier. The stress of re-entering the world after decades of hiding was clearly taking its toll. "Besides," Margaret continued, "there are things happening in the world right now that require someone with my knowledge to speak up. Nuclear proliferation has gotten worse, not better, since I disappeared. There are weapons being developed and deployed that make the threats of the 1980s look trivial. Sarah felt a chill. What do you mean? I mean that my expertise is needed again, whether certain people like it or not. The work I did in hiding was important, but it wasn't enough. Now I need to be public again, to testify, to warn people about what's coming. Mr. Patterson set down his coffee cup with a slight clank. Dr. Thompson, with all due respect, if you're talking about testifying publicly about current nuclear programs, you're going to make the same enemies who forced you into hiding the first time. Margaret's laugh was rueful but determined. Mr. Patterson, those enemies never stopped trying to find me. The difference now is that I'm choosing to make myself visible on my own terms, rather than waiting for them to discover me on theirs. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah's phone buzzing with a text message. The sender was unknown, but the message was clear: stop helping her. This is your only warning. Sarah's blood ran cold as she showed the message to Margaret and Mr. Patterson. Margaret read it without surprise, but her jaw tightened with anger. I'm sorry, Margaret said. I hope that by handling this through proper banking channels, we could avoid dragging you into the dangerous aspects of my situation. But it appears that someone has been monitoring the verification process. Mr. Patterson stood up abruptly. That's it. I'm calling the police. Margaret reached out and gently touched his arm. James, the police can't protect you from the kind of people who send messages like that. But I can. How? By making this story public immediately, before they have time to organize a response. Once the world knows I'm alive, harming any of us becomes counterproductive for them. Sarah looked around the coffee shop, suddenly, aware of every person who might be watching them. What do you mean, make the story public? Margaret pulled out her phone and showed them a contact list that included numbers for major newspapers, television networks, and online news organizations. I've been preparing for this day for years. I have contacts in the media who have been waiting for this story, documents that prove everything I'm telling you, and evidence of corruption that goes far beyond what I testified about in the 1980s. But if you reveal everything now, won't that put you in more danger? Sarah asked. Margaret's smile was sad but resolute. My dear, I've been in danger every day for 37 years. At least now I have the chance to do something meaningful with whatever time I have left. As if to emphasize her point, Margaret's phone began ringing. The caller ID showed a Washington, D.C. area code. Dr. Thompson, she answered formally. Sarah and Mr. Patterson could only hear Margaret's side of the conversation, but her responses made it clear that someone very powerful was very unhappy about her reappearance. Yes, I understand your concerns. No, I will not agree to return to hiding. That's correct, I do have documentation of everything. I think you misunderstand your leverage in this situation. The call lasted less than 5 minutes, but by the end of it, Margaret's transformation was complete. The humble, quietly dressed elderly woman who had entered the bank 2 days earlier was gone, replaced by someone who radiated the authority and determination that had once made her one of the most influential scientists in government. Who was that? Mr. Patterson asked. Someone who thinks he can intimidate me the way they did in 1987. He's about to learn that fear loses its power when you have nothing left to lose. Margaret gathered her things and prepared to leave. Sarah, James, I want you both to know that meeting you has reminded me why this fight is worth having. You treated me with respect and dignity when you had no reason to do so other than basic human decency. That gives me hope for the kind of world we can create if enough people are willing to stand up for what's right. She handed Sarah a business card with only a phone number written on it. If anyone threatens you or makes you feel unsafe, call this number immediately. The person who answers will be able to help you. Who is it? Sarah asked. Someone else who's supposed to be dead, Margaret replied with a slight smile. You'll be amazed how many of us there are when you start looking. As Margaret walked away from the coffee shop, Sarah realized that their encounter with her was just the beginning of something much larger. The quiet revelation in a bank conference room was about to become a public earthquake that would shake the foundations of government secrecy and corporate power. That afternoon, as Sarah returned to work, she found the bank buzzing with unusual activity. Security had been increased, and several well-dressed individuals who were clearly not customers were asking questions about the previous day's transactions. Mr. Patterson pulled Sarah aside. "The FBI was here this morning. They wanted copies of all our documentation regarding Dr. Thompson's transaction. I told them they would need a warrant. Did they get one? They're working on it. But, Sarah, I think we're about to become part of a much bigger story than we bargained for." That evening, as Sarah watched the news at home, the lead story made her heart race. Breaking news: nuclear physicist presumed dead for decades emerges from hiding with explosive revelations about government cover-ups. Margaret Thompson's face filled the screen, and Sarah recognized the determined expression she had worn during their conversation that morning. But now that expression was being broadcast to millions of people, along with documents and testimony that would change how the public understood decades of government secrecy. The reporter's voice was grave. Dr. Thompson claims to have evidence of illegal weapons sales, cover-ups of nuclear safety incidents, and the systematic silencing of scientists who tried to warn the public about national security threats. She says she has been gathering this evidence for 37 years while living in hiding. Sarah's phone rang. It was Mr. Patterson. "Are you watching the news?" "Yes," Sarah replied, still staring at the television. "Our lives just changed completely," he said. "By tomorrow morning, every reporter in the country is going to want to interview us." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that her simple act of treating an elderly customer with respect had set in motion events that would ultimately expose decades of corruption and remind the world that some truths are worth any sacrifice to reveal. But she also understood that Margaret Thompson's courage in revealing herself meant that all of them, Sarah, Mr. Patterson, and Margaret herself, were now part of a story that powerful people would do anything to suppress. The question was whether their commitment to doing what was right would be enough to see them through whatever came next. 3 weeks after Margaret Thompson's identification was verified at First National Bank, the world had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. What began as a simple banking transaction had evolved into the biggest government transparency story of the decade, with ramifications that extended far beyond anything Sarah Martinez had imagined when she first saw that worn driver's license. Sarah stood in the green room of a major television network, adjusting her blazer for the third time in 5 minutes. In 20 minutes, she would be interviewed live on national television about her role in uncovering one of the most significant stories of government corruption and cover-ups in modern American history. The irony wasn't lost on her that a bank teller from Chicago was about to become the face of a movement for government accountability. "You look nervous," said a familiar voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Margaret Thompson entering the green room, but this Margaret was barely recognizable as the humble elderly woman who had shuffled up to her teller window 3 weeks earlier. This Margaret wore a sharp business suit, moved with confident purpose, and carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent decades navigating the highest levels of government and academia. "I am nervous," Sarah admitted. "I never expected to become part of something this big." Margaret sat down beside her, and Sarah was struck by how much healthier and more energetic she looked. "You know, in all my years of fighting corruption and trying to protect whistleblowers, I never imagined that the breakthrough would come through a young woman who simply treated a customer with kindness and professionalism." The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. After Margaret's initial television interview, the floodgates had opened. Other scientists, government employees, and military personnel who had been forced into hiding or silence had begun coming forward with their own stories. The revelations painted a picture of systematic corruption that spanned multiple decades and administrations. "How many others are there?" Sarah asked. "People like you who are supposed to be dead but aren't?" Margaret's smile was both sad and hopeful. "More than you might think, fewer than we need. But the important thing is that they're no longer afraid to speak out. Your example, the way you handled our first meeting, showed them that there are still people in the world who will listen to the truth and act on it with integrity." The door to the green room opened, and Mr. Patterson entered, looking remarkably composed for a man whose quiet career in banking had suddenly thrust him into the national spotlight. Behind him came Janet Chen, the fraud investigator whose meticulous documentation had provided crucial verification of Margaret's identity. "Are we all ready for this?" Mr. Patterson asked, straightening his tie. "As ready as anyone can be for changing the world," Margaret replied with a slight laugh. The past weeks had revealed the full scope of what Margaret had been working on during her decades in hiding. Using her network of fellow hidden scientists and whistleblowers, she had documented weapons sales to hostile nations, cover-ups of nuclear accidents, and the systematic intimidation of government employees who tried to report safety violations or ethical breaches. But, more than that, she had been secretly funding research into peaceful applications of nuclear technology, supporting environmental cleanup efforts, and providing financial assistance to other whistleblowers who had been forced to flee or go underground. The $8 million in her bank account represented just a fraction of the resources she had coordinated over nearly 4 decades of clandestine activism. "Dr. Thompson," Sarah said, "I have to ask, was it worth it? Giving up your life, your identity, your recognition for all those years?" Margaret considered the question carefully. 3 weeks ago, I would have said yes, but with deep sadness for everything I had to sacrifice. Today, seeing how many people have found the courage to speak out because of what happened in your bank, I can say yes with complete conviction. The television interview that followed would be remembered as one of the most significant moments in the ongoing struggle for government transparency. Margaret Thompson, speaking publicly for the first time in 37 years, laid out a case for systematic corruption that was so well documented and thoroughly researched that even her harshest critics couldn't dismiss it. But what made the interview truly powerful was the participation of Sarah, Mr. Patterson, and Janet Chen. Their presence demonstrated that ordinary citizens, faced with extraordinary circumstances, had chosen to do the right thing regardless of the personal risks involved. "When Dr. Thompson showed me her identification," Sarah said during the interview, "I had a choice. I could have dismissed her as confused or delusional, or I could have taken her seriously enough to investigate. The fact that she turned out to be who she claimed to be isn't really the point. The point is that we should always take people seriously when they're trying to tell us something important." The interview triggered immediate responses from Capitol Hill. Within hours, 3 congressional committees had announced investigations into the allegations Margaret had presented. The FBI launched a formal review of its handling of her disappearance. And, most significantly, other government employees began coming forward with additional evidence supporting her claims. But, perhaps the most important immediate result was the establishment of the Thompson Foundation for Scientific Ethics, funded initially with Margaret's $8 million but quickly growing as donations poured in from around the world. The foundation's mission was to protect and support scientists and government employees who spoke out about corruption, safety violations, or ethical breaches. 2 months later, Sarah found herself in Washington, D.C., testifying before a congressional committee about the importance of protecting whistleblowers and creating safe channels for reporting government corruption. Sitting beside her was Margaret Thompson, who had accepted an appointment as a senior advisor to the Senate Committee on Government Oversight. "Ms. Martinez," asked the committee chairman, "what do you think we can learn from Dr. Thompson's experience and your encounter with her?" Sarah looked out at the packed hearing room, filled with reporters, government officials, and citizens who had come to witness this moment. "I think we learned that heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like. Dr. Thompson came into our bank looking like any elderly customer, but she was carrying the weight of decades of work to protect our country and our world." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But, more than that, I think we learned that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they choose to act with integrity. Mr. Patterson, Mrs. Chen, and I didn't do anything heroic. We just did our jobs with honesty and respect for human dignity. But, sometimes, that's enough to change everything." The hearing room was silent as Sarah continued. Dr. Thompson sacrificed her identity, her recognition, and her normal life to continue fighting for what she believed was right. The least we can do is create systems that protect people like her so they don't have to make those kinds of sacrifices in the future. Margaret reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand, a gesture that was captured by photographers and would appear on newspaper front pages around the world the next day. 6 months after that initial banking transaction, significant changes had begun to take shape. New whistleblower protection laws were passed with bipartisan support. The Thompson Foundation had grown into an international organization supporting truthtellers in dozens of countries. And, most remarkably, 17 other presumed dead scientists and government employees had emerged from hiding to add their voices to calls for greater transparency and accountability. Margaret Thompson's health had stabilized with new cancer treatments that had become available during her years in hiding. While she remained terminally ill, doctors now estimated that she might have years rather than months to continue her work. "You know," Margaret told Sarah during a quiet moment at the Foundation's first annual gala, "I spent so many years wondering if my disappearance had accomplished anything positive. I thought maybe I had just given up and run away." "And now?" Sarah asked. "Now I realize that everything I did during those hidden years was preparation for this moment. For the chance to make a real difference in how our government operates and how it treats people who try to do the right thing." Sarah looked around the gala, filled with scientists, activists, government employees, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by Margaret's story to become more engaged in issues of transparency and accountability. "Dr. Thompson," she said, "I think your legacy is just beginning." As the evening wound down, Sarah reflected on how drastically her life had changed since that ordinary Tuesday morning when she had asked to see an elderly customer's identification. She had discovered that sometimes the most important moments in history begin with small acts of human decency, and that courage can be contagious when people are willing to stand up for what they believe is right. Margaret Thompson had shown the world that it's never too late to emerge from the shadows and fight for justice. And Sarah Martinez had learned that a bank teller in Chicago could help change the world, one transaction at a time. The story that began with a simple request, "I'll need to see some identification, please," had become a testament to the power of truth, the importance of treating all people with dignity, and the extraordinary impact that ordinary individuals can have when they choose to act with courage and integrity. In the end, Margaret Thompson's most important revelation wasn't the government corruption she exposed or the weapons proliferation she documented. It was the reminder that heroes are often hidden among us, waiting for someone to see them clearly enough to help them step back into the light. And, sometimes, that someone is a young bank teller who simply chooses to treat every customer with the respect and attention they deserve, never knowing that such basic human decency might be the key that unlocks decades of hidden truth and changes the course of history.